Mia Khalifa is, by any reasonable metric, one of the most recognizable adult film performers of all time, an outcome made all the more unusual by the fact that her actual time in the industry was remarkably brief. One particular video, which sparked intense global backlash and controversy, catapulted her into instant notoriety. Within weeks, she became the most searched name on adult websites worldwide, a position she would inexplicably hold for years. Fame arrived overnight. So did condemnation. Years later, Khalifa reemerged in the public conversation with a very different narrative. She claimed that despite becoming one of the most profitable faces in the industry, she earned only around $112,000 in total. She described an exploitative system that manipulated her, ruined her personal life, and discarded her once it had extracted maximum value. This reframing resonated strongly in a cultural moment increasingly critical of power imbalances, and Khalifa was widely recast as a victim of a predatory industry. But as her story gained traction, inconsistencies began to surface. Over time, key elements of her account shifted. She has said she was initially approached for nude modeling and gradually coerced into adult films, yet archive material shows she had posted explicit content online prior to this. She described being pushed into the industry against her will, while earlier interviews show her expressing enthusiasm about participating. She stated she worked for only 3 months and earned $112,000, while the production company claims her involvement spanned closer to 3 years, with earnings exceeding $170,000. She publicly denounced the industry, only to later monetize her sexuality again through other platforms under a different label. None of this automatically invalidates her claims. Memory is imperfect, trauma complicates narratives, and industries can indeed be exploitative without fitting a single clean storyline. But it does raise a fair question. Is Mia Khalifa's public image a case of genuine victimhood, strategic reinvention, or some uncomfortable combination of both? Before any of that, though, there is the context that often gets glossed over. Mia Khalifa was born in 1993 in Lebanon, a country with deep religious and cultural divisions. Although often assumed to be Muslim, she was raised Catholic. Her father was devout, and she even bears a Catholic symbol tattooed on her hand. She attended a French private school where she learned English, before her family fled Lebanon in 2011 amid violent protests tied to regional instability and Syrian involvement. Relocating to the United States was not a seamless fresh start. Arriving as a Middle Eastern family in the post-9/11 era came with its own set of challenges. Suspicion, prejudice, and cultural alienation were not abstract concepts. They were daily realities. Being young, foreign, visibly other, and trying to find an identity in a country that wasn't especially welcoming created pressures that don't neatly fit into headlines or hashtags, which is precisely why her story resists simple conclusions. It is not a morality play with a single villain and a single victim. It is a case study in fame, agency, contradiction, and the modern economy of outrage, where truth is rarely clean, and reinvention is often rewarded more than consistency. And that, more than any single number or contract, is what keeps the debate alive. By her own account, Mia's early years in the United States were defined less by opportunity and more by isolation. She has described being relentlessly bullied, labeled the darkest, weirdest kid in school, perpetually out of place in an environment where nearly everyone around her was white and Jewish. She's spoken openly about wanting desperately to belong, wanting a bar mitzvah, wanting to eat the same peanut butter and jelly sandwiches, wanting, above all, to be indistinguishable. Instead, she stood out in the worst possible way. This was compounded by the cultural fallout of post-9/11 America. Being Middle Eastern during that period was not merely awkward, it was openly hostile. Slurs, suspicion, and social exclusion were routine. Friends were few. Acceptance was conditional. Childhood, by her description, was something to survive rather than enjoy. As if that weren't enough, she was also bullied for her weight, which seeded deep self-image issues early on. Feeling unattractive, unwanted, and invisible became part of her identity. Eventually, her family sent her to Massanutten Military Academy in Virginia, a move presumably intended to provide structure and discipline, but which introduced its own problems. It was there, at just 16 years old, that she met her future husband. He was 23. The age gap alone is troubling. The fact that they married immediately after she turned 18 does not improve the optics. Khalifa has since acknowledged that this relationship was less about love and more about validation. In her own words, she was searching for approval wherever she could find it, particularly from older men, because she had never learned how to generate it internally. After high school, she enrolled at the University of Texas at El Paso. Khalifa claims she earned a degree in history and graduated early, crediting advanced coursework from military school that carried over as college credits. The explanation is plausible on paper. However, there is no publicly verifiable record of her graduation. Her legal name does not appear in commencement programs from that period. It's not definitive proof of anything, but it does add another small question mark to an already inconsistent timeline. Then there's the matter of her weight loss, which she frequently cites as a turning point in her self-confidence. She claims to have lost roughly 50 pounds during college, a significant change by any standard. The issue is not the weight loss itself, but the shifting explanations of how it happened. In one interview, she describes a fairly conventional process: exercising, cutting out soda, avoiding alcohol. In another, she offers a far more troubling account: starving herself, abusing laxatives, and engaging in behavior consistent with an eating disorder. These explanations are not merely different, they are fundamentally incompatible. It's important to be careful here. Eating disorders are serious, complex, and often accompanied by denial or revisionist memory. If anything, the contradiction itself may be revealing. People rarely recount disordered behavior consistently, especially when shame and image management are involved. If one were to speculate, it is not unreasonable to assume that unhealthy methods played a role, even if they are uncomfortable to admit publicly. Taken together, this period of Mia Khalifa's life paints a consistent psychological picture. Even if the factual details remain muddy, a young woman shaped by exclusion, insecurity, and a persistent need for external validation. The specifics may shift depending on the interview, but the underlying pattern does not. And even after the weight loss, the insecurities didn't disappear. She was thinner, yes, but the change came with consequences she wasn't prepared for. Rapid weight loss left her with loose skin, and the first place it showed was her chest. She has described the experience bluntly. At barely 20 years old, she felt as though her body had aged decades overnight. Clothing fit poorly. Bras didn't sit right. Swimwear was out of the question. Instead of feeling proud of what she'd accomplished, she felt exposed and embarrassed. The psychological hit was significant. She has said that losing weight didn't restore her confidence the way she'd hoped. It simply revealed new flaws for her to fix, so she decided to address the ones she felt most keenly. She began researching breast augmentation extensively: surgeons, procedures, costs, outcomes. This wasn't impulsive, it was methodical, and ultimately, it took her to Miami. She's explained that while Beverly Hills was considered the gold standard, Coral Gables offered comparable expertise without requiring a move to California. During college, she saved specifically for the surgery, viewing it as an investment in herself, an attempt to finally align how she felt inside with how she looked on the outside. After the procedure, the change was immediate. She has described it as a glow-up, and for the first time, strangers responded to her differently. Where she once felt ignored or judged, she now received attention she had craved for most of her life. The validation was intoxicating. It confirmed something she had long doubted: that she could be desirable. At the time, she was living in Miami with her husband and working at Fuddruckers to make ends meet. Life was still modest, but her self-perception had shifted. And it was during this period, roughly 3 years after college, that she says the next turning point occurred. According to her account, she was walking outside a strip mall near her workplace when a car abruptly stopped beside her. A well-dressed, middle-aged man rolled down the window and told her she was stunning. He said she had the ideal look for nude modeling and handed her a business card. He appeared professional: button-down shirt, slacks, calm demeanor, and introduced himself as a marketing executive. Curious but cautious, she went home, thought it over, and eventually agreed to visit the office. What she encountered, she later emphasized, didn't resemble the seedy backroom stereotypes people often imagine. This wasn't a basement operation. It was corporate, polished, and well-funded. The company was Score Group, a long-established adult media corporation based in Miami with decades of industry presence. At first, she hesitated. This wasn't a decision you could casually undo. But she was also experiencing something new: consistent male validation, and it felt powerful. After years of being overlooked, the idea that someone viewed her as professionally attractive was deeply affirming. That validation tipped the scales, and she agreed. Khalifa has framed this moment as the beginning of her recruitment into the adult industry, the point where a vulnerable young woman was drawn into what she later described as one of the most exploitative industries in the world. And while that specific encounter may well have happened as she described it, what complicates the narrative is the implication that this was her first exposure to explicit content creation. Because it wasn't. What often goes unmentioned is the role her husband played during this period, particularly given that he was, by her own admission, deeply consumed by pornography. And that detail becomes difficult to ignore once you begin examining what came next. By Mia's own admission, her marriage was deeply dysfunctional. She has described her husband as having an extreme pornography fixation, so severe that their intimacy was reportedly contingent on him consuming porn first. Sex, in that context, became less about connection and more about performance inside someone else's fantasy. That dynamic matters because it sets the backdrop for choices that followed. Before Mia ever appeared in professional adult content, she and her husband were already active online in explicit communities. Posts attributed to accounts widely believed to belong to the couple circulated on Reddit within cuckolding and hot wife forums. These posts framed their relationship as performative and exhibitionist, with captions and exchanges designed to provoke attention and reaction. In several instances, the husband actively encouraged scenarios intended to draw sexual interest from other men, sometimes commenting approvingly or urging escalation. Archived material, screenshots, comments, and posts suggest that this activity predated her professional debut by a significant margin. In some threads, the husband reportedly confirmed personal details that matched Mia's background, including her Lebanese heritage. While online attribution should always be treated cautiously, the consistency across posts and timelines has led many to conclude this was not coincidence. This context complicates the later claim that her entry into adult work was sudden or wholly external. It does not negate the possibility of exploitation, but it does undermine the idea that explicit content was entirely foreign to her life at the time. There is also an often overlooked chapter from her college years. In interviews, Mia has mentioned working as a bartender, modeling, and briefly appearing as a briefcase model on a Spanish-language game show. What she rarely discusses is her time working as a stripper at an El Paso club in 2012, well before her professional adult career. Video evidence from that period exists and aligns with the timeline prior to her cosmetic surgery, placing it firmly before 2014. Taken together, the trajectory looks less like a sudden fall and more like a gradual progression. Over several years, she moved through increasingly sexualized forms of validation: online exhibitionism, stripping, nude modeling, before arriving at professional adult films. The motivations are open to interpretation: financial independence, rebellion, self-esteem repair, or simply the reinforcement of attention she had long been denied. What is difficult to dispute is the role her husband played throughout. When the nude modeling offer finally arrived, he strongly encouraged her to accept it. By then, explicit images were already circulating, boundaries had already shifted, and the line between private and public sexuality had largely dissolved. In that context, the decision may not have felt like a leap at all, but merely the next logical step. And that distinction between being pulled into something versus already walking toward it is where much of the debate truly lives. Mia has said she never expected anyone to really notice her. History, of course, disagreed. When she first entered the adult industry, she performed under the stage name Mia Khalifa. During this initial phase, she produced a substantial amount of material, hundreds of photos and multiple hours of recorded content. This alone exposes a recurring weakness in how her story is often told. In later retellings, she implies that her first experience in adult video was sudden and tied directly to Bang Bros. The record shows otherwise. Her career had already begun, and momentum was already building. It was through Score Group that she first developed a recognizable presence. The attention she gained there eventually opened the door to work with Bang Bros, where she rebranded herself as Mia Khalifa. Mia reportedly taken from her dog, and Khalifa borrowed from rapper Wiz Khalifa. For the record, many people assumed a family connection. There wasn't one. Shortly after signing, producers learned she spoke Arabic. That detail, rather than any long-term strategy, became the catalyst for the video that would define her entire public identity. The concept leaned directly into shock value, pairing pornography with religious symbolism. When the video was released, it went viral almost instantly, but not in a way anyone could realistically call positive. The backlash was immediate and global. For Muslims around the world, the video was deeply offensive. The imagery was seen not just as provocative, but as deliberately disrespectful, particularly given Mia's Lebanese background. In Lebanon, outrage was intense. To many, it felt like a rejection of cultural identity for the sake of attention. The fury did not remain abstract, it became personal. Mia began receiving large volumes of hate messages and death threats, including threats attributed to extremist sympathizers. Some messages included graphic imagery intended to intimidate. Several countries banned her content outright, including Lebanon. The controversy eventually reached her family, who issued a public statement formally distancing themselves from her actions, emphasizing that they did not reflect their beliefs, values, or upbringing. In practical terms, she was disowned. Ironically, the same controversy that isolated her also made her famous. Her social media following exploded almost overnight: 6 figures on Twitter, millions on Instagram. Even there, the chaos followed her. Her account was eventually hacked by individuals claiming ideological motives. Mia's response to the outrage was telling. Rather than retreat, she leaned into sarcasm. She responded to critics with humor, mockery, and open defiance, often treating condemnation as fuel rather than warning. When one person told her she would be the first person in hellfire, she didn't apologize. She joked. That reaction cemented her persona just as much as the video itself. Whether out of bravado, coping, or calculation, she chose confrontation over contrition, and in doing so, she crossed the point of no return. At that moment, Mia Khalifa stopped being merely a performer and became a symbol, one interpreted very differently depending on who was looking. And once that happens, control over the narrative becomes far more difficult to reclaim. Mia did not respond to the backlash with apology or retreat. She responded with sarcasm. When one critic warned that she would be beheaded soon, she replied that she had been meaning to get a little tan. When another threatened her life during prayer, she joked that as long as it wasn't her chest, she could live with it. Those were expensive. She mocked the outrage further, asking whether the Middle East didn't have more pressing concerns, such as political instability or the rise of extremist groups. The tone of her responses suggested something important. None of this seemed to surprise her. In fact, she openly acknowledged that while she expected people to be offended by the hijab, she was not shocked by the escalation to death threats either. In her view, outrage culture online routinely crosses that line. To her, this was simply the internet doing what it always does, only louder. Mia attempted to reframe the video as satire, arguing that critics were selectively outraged. She pointed to Hollywood, claiming that mainstream films had portrayed Muslims in far more damaging and dehumanizing ways for decades, without triggering comparable backlash. The problem with that defense, however, was its vagueness. She cited no specific examples, and many critics argued the comparison wasn't equivalent. Hollywood stereotypes are problematic, but they are not the same as deliberately staging religious transgression for shock value. To her critics, this wasn't hypocrisy, it was category error. Around the same period, Mia separated from her husband, marking the end of a relationship that had been deeply intertwined with her entry into the industry. But while condemnation dominated headlines, it wasn't universal. Some voices pushed back against the outrage. Many argued that death threats were indefensible regardless of offense. British-Lebanese author Nasri Attallah publicly defended her, emphasizing bodily autonomy and agency. His argument was simple. As a woman living in the West, she had the right to make choices about her own body and owed no moral obedience to a country she no longer lived in. To supporters, the moral outrage wasn't principled. It was selective and coercive. In Western countries, the controversy registered far less intensely. Cultural norms differed. And while many found the video tasteless, few saw it as existentially offensive. Ironically, the backlash did not make Mia toxic within the adult industry. It made her valuable. Even more ironic was where popularity surged. Despite being banned in several Middle Eastern countries, search data showed that a significant portion of interest in her content came from those same regions. During the peak of the controversy, roughly a quarter of searches for her videos originated in Lebanon alone. Executives at major adult platforms openly described the situation as a textbook example of the Streisand effect. Attempts at censorship only amplified visibility. Her name climbed to the top of global search rankings. A brewery in Lebanon even capitalized on the moment, running an advertisement featuring her signature glasses beside a bottle with the slogan, "Don't worry, both are 18+. Controversy had crossed into cultural parody. In entertainment, especially adult entertainment, attention is currency, and by that metric, Mia Khalifa had become extraordinarily valuable. Rather than distancing themselves, the parent company behind Bang Bros moved to secure her with a long-term contract. At that point, the outcome was unavoidable. What began as a single shock-driven scene had escalated into global notoriety. Whether admired, despised, or defended, Mia Khalifa was no longer just another performer. She was a brand, and the industry had every incentive to keep her exactly where she was. The long-term contract was designed to capitalize on her sudden notoriety. Under its terms, she would film a limited number of scenes each month, enough to keep demand high without oversaturating her image. But almost as quickly as her rise, Mia had a change of heart. Just 3 months in, she walked away. The scale of the backlash had finally reached her. The attention, positive or negative, became overwhelming. What initially felt like validation turned into something corrosive. She later described it as a moment of clarity. None of it was worth the psychological cost. Fame, in her case, arrived without insulation, and the scrutiny was relentless. Although she cut ties with performing, she did not immediately sever all connections to Bang Bros. For a time, she continued working as a cam model, a role that allowed her to earn income from her image while maintaining firmer boundaries. Estimates suggest she remained in that capacity until around 2017, when she finally exited the adult industry entirely. Mia's goal after that was straightforward in theory and nearly impossible in practice. She wanted a normal life. She applied for conventional jobs and briefly worked as a paralegal and later as a bookkeeper. Both attempts failed for the same reason. Her past followed her everywhere. A simple Google search erased any chance of anonymity, and the attention, from coworkers and even supervisors, quickly became inappropriate and invasive. Public life was no easier. She has said that going outside often meant being recognized, filmed without consent, or approached aggressively. Her previous career had branded her in a way that could not be shed simply by changing direction. Still, there was a turning point, or at least the promise of one. Toward the end of 2017, Complex reached out with an unexpected opportunity, co-hosting a sports show alongside former NBA player Gilbert Arenas. For Mia, a lifelong sports fan with genuine knowledge of the field, this felt like a legitimate exit ramp, a chance to pivot into something she cared about and rebuild her public identity. That optimism proved short-lived. While she held her own on the show, much of the audience fixated less on her commentary and more on her past. Behind the scenes, professional boundaries eroded again. She received direct messages from multiple athletes attempting to initiate personal contact, messages she later shared publicly on Twitter. While exposing this behavior may have been justified, it also kept her tied to the very image she was trying to escape. The show lasted just 3 months, an irony that didn't go unnoticed. A similar pattern followed with her next role, hosting Sports Ball for Rooster Teeth. That opportunity ended by late 2018. By then, she had been out of adult content for years, yet the public hadn't moved on. In 2018 alone, she was still the most searched performer on major adult platforms. The disconnect between her actual body of work and her cultural footprint was staggering. One of the reasons her name continued circulating in mainstream culture was a diss track released by the group I Love Friday. The song was inspired by a tweet attributed to Mia that criticized a rapper for disrespecting Muslim women. The irony was clear enough, but the problem was simpler. The tweet was fake. It was an obvious meme. The group mistook it for a genuine statement and built an entire song around it. Even years after leaving the industry, Mia Khalifa remains trapped in a feedback loop of controversy, misattribution, and cultural shorthand. Her career may have lasted only months, but her reputation had taken on a life of its own, one she never fully managed to outrun. The song dropped in 2018 and initially went viral for a fairly simple reason. People found it ridiculous. It was catchy, repetitive, and easy to parody. But what truly cemented it into pop culture wasn't YouTube or radio, it was TikTok. From 2018 to 2019, the track became a full-blown anthem on the platform. If you were on TikTok during that era, you almost certainly heard it, probably more times than you wanted to. The numbers were staggering. The song was used in millions of videos, accumulated hundreds of millions of views, climbed into Spotify's top 50, and pushed the YouTube upload past 140 million views. What started as a diss track became a nostalgia trigger almost overnight. Ironically, most people today know it not as a Mia Khalifa diss, but simply as that TikTok song. The problem, however, was that many listeners believed the premise of the song was real. The tweet that inspired it, attributed to Mia, was fake. It was an obvious meme. Yet that didn't stop waves of people from directing fresh hostility at her, long after she had exited the adult industry entirely. It remains unclear whether I Love Friday knew the tweet was fake when they released the song. Publicly, they never clarified. What they did say, after the truth surfaced, was that Mia should be thanking them for the exposure. They framed the song as a favor, implying that ridicule and renewed harassment were somehow career opportunities. It was a bold stance, bordering on delusional, especially considering the song's success far outpaced anything else they would ever release. Mia initially said nothing while the track exploded. And in the long run, she arguably did get the last laugh. The song became the duo's sole cultural footprint, not a one-hit wonder, but closer to a one-verse phenomenon. Still, that didn't make the moment any less damaging for her personally. By that point, Mia was at a low few public figures ever openly admit to. She was famous, but not respected. Banned from her home country, estranged from her family, unable to walk in public without being stared at, recorded, or approached inappropriately. Online, she was mocked daily. Her messages were flooded with harassment, and despite her name recognition, she struggled to translate that notoriety into stable income. In 2019, she finally snapped back, this time not at critics, but at the industry itself. Mia revealed that she had earned roughly $112,000 total during her entire time in professional adult films. The figure shocked people. Given her visibility, many assumed she was a millionaire. The disconnect between fame and earnings exposed a fundamental misunderstanding. Most people believed she had been active in adult films for years, when in reality her on-camera career lasted only about 3 months. She expanded on these claims in interviews, including one with BBC News, where she alleged that she was intimidated into performing the infamous hijab scene. According to her, when the concept was pitched, she warned producers that it could get her killed. She says they laughed it off. She later explained that while no one physically forced her, she felt pressured by the imbalance of power, fear of retaliation, and lack of support. That distinction, between coercion and consent under pressure, became central to the debate. Critics pointed out that no one can be legally compelled to perform a sex act on camera. Supporters countered that intimidation doesn't require physical force to be effective, especially for a young performer with little leverage. And that is where the story fully fractures. Depending on where one stands, Mia Khalifa is either a cautionary tale of exploitation amplified by internet culture, or an example of someone retroactively reframing their choices to survive the consequences. The truth, inconveniently, may sit somewhere in between. Mia attempted to clarify what she meant by intimidation, drawing a comparison that, while mundane, was revealing. She likened it to the feeling of being nervous to correct an order at a restaurant, not outright fear, but a hesitation rooted in power imbalance and uncertainty. She emphasized that she was young, inexperienced, and unsure how much resistance she was allowed to show without consequences. At the core of her argument was a simple claim. She believed she was treated as a disposable revenue stream by an industry that profited enormously while she absorbed nearly all the long-term consequences. When asked why she didn't have legal representation or advisors, her response was blunt. She was 21. Most people that age don't have lawyers on retainer, let alone the foresight to negotiate complex contracts in unfamiliar industry. That interview resonated. One segment alone amassed over 18 million views on YouTube. The momentum carried forward. Mia began appearing on more podcasts and platforms, repeating her story in greater detail. Gradually, public perception shifted. For the first time in years, a substantial audience began viewing her less as a punchline and more as someone trying to survive the fallout of an experience she no longer controlled. Around this time, she also entered a new relationship with professional chef Robert Sandberg. According to her, one of the most meaningful aspects of that relationship was that he didn't know who she was when they met. There was no baggage, no preconceived narrative. That anonymity, brief as it was, gave her the confidence to re-engage with social media, particularly TikTok. On TikTok, she presented a version of herself that many had never seen. She spoke candidly about regret and trauma, often using humor as a buffer. She reiterated that she felt manipulated into signing contracts she didn't fully understand. But she also expanded her platform beyond her own story. During the Black Lives Matter protests, she posted consistently in support of the movement. She auctioned her iconic glasses and donated the proceeds to victims of the 2020 Beirut explosion. These actions earned her renewed goodwill. Supporters began to rally loudly. The dominant narrative became sympathetic. She was manipulated, underpaid, and discarded by a predatory industry despite becoming one of its most recognizable faces after only a few months of work. To many, she embodied a broader critique of exploitation. That momentum culminated in a change.org petition demanding that Bang Bros remove all content featuring her. The petition gathered nearly 2 million signatures. At that point, Bang Bros responded, not with an apology, but with a counteroffensive. They launched a dedicated website addressing her claims point by point. According to the company, Mia did not earn $112,000 over 3 months. They claimed she earned closer to $180,000 over a period of roughly 2 years and 9 months. Broken down monthly, that equated to approximately $5,400 per month, or about $65,000 annually, well above Miami's average income at the time, which hovered around $47,000. From their perspective, the math didn't support exploitation. From hers, the framing was misleading. She argued that while she received a one-time payment, the company continued generating revenue from her work indefinitely. However, Bang Bros countered that this is standard industry practice. Performers are paid per scene, not through royalties. At the time, a typical rate was around $1,000 per scene. By that model, frequent performers could earn significant sums, but only if they continued working. This is where the dispute becomes less about numbers and more about expectations. Mia framed her experience through the lens of long-term consequences and brand permanence. Bang Bros framed it as a standard transaction governed by well-established norms. Both positions can be factually accurate while still being ethically incompatible, and that tension between contractual legality and personal fallout is what ultimately keeps the debate unresolved. In theory, an adult performer could earn a substantial income under the standard per-scene payment model. Few people are that consistent, but the math does work. If Mia filmed roughly 1 scene per week over 3 months, the earnings add up quickly. One could argue that performers should negotiate royalties for content that generates revenue indefinitely. Many actors in film and television do, but that simply isn't how the adult industry has historically operated. The agreement Mia signed was standard for the time. Mia has also claimed she appeared in only 12 scenes. Bang Bros disputes this and produced documentation showing 28 scenes in total. If the reported $178,000 figure includes those scenes plus her time as a cam performer, then financially, she likely did reasonably well, especially when factoring in income from other companies and nude modeling work during the same period. In other words, her total earnings were likely higher than the number she later emphasized. On the question of manipulation, Bang Bros has consistently maintained that Mia was not pushed into a long-term deal. In fact, they claim the opposite. According to them, she negotiated for a longer contract than initially proposed and was actively involved in setting its terms. There is footage of Mia herself celebrating the deal, noting that she had secured an arrangement limiting her to roughly 1 scene per week over several months. The same pattern appears with the hijab video. Mia now says she felt intimidated and pressured to perform it. Bang Bros counters that she had significant creative control over content and points to earlier clips in which she explicitly stated that she conceived the ideas herself, wrote descriptions, and treated the platform as a space to act out personal fantasies. At the time, she publicly defended the scene, dismissed criticism with humor, and mocked those who reacted angrily. That contrast is difficult to ignore. Early on, she framed the controversy as satire and laughed off threats. Years later, she described the same event as coercive and traumatic. Similarly, she has alternated between saying she was underpaid and manipulated and acknowledging that she understood the contracts, didn't have a bad deal, and that the lack of royalties is universal in the industry, not unique to her. She has also accused Bang Bros of deliberately promoting her videos during moments of controversy to profit from the drama. Bang Bros denies this, arguing that the traffic spikes correlate not with internal promotion, but with media cycles driven by Mia herself. They released search trend data showing clear surges whenever she made headlines, whether it was a public claim, a viral interview, or a social media controversy. Eventually, Bang Bros sent her a cease and desist letter. Since then, Mia has largely avoided naming the company directly. She continues to criticize the adult industry broadly, but no longer targets Bang Bros specifically. Regardless of where one lands on the dispute, one outcome is undeniable. The controversy significantly boosted her social media career. By the end of 2020, she had surpassed 15 million followers on TikTok, alongside massive followings on Instagram and Twitter. Today, she approaches 40 million TikTok followers. At that point, the story stopped being about contracts and scenes and became something else entirely, a case study in how notoriety, grievance, and platform economics can converge into a second career far more lucrative and controllable than the first. With her public sympathy at its peak, Mia Khalifa made a calculated pivot and launched an OnlyFans account. The reaction was immediate and predictable. Jokes spread quickly. Many people remarked that they had already seen this movie, implying that the move contradicted everything she had just said about leaving that world behind. Initially, Mia insisted she would never post nude content on the platform. Over time, that position softened, while she maintained boundaries, limiting what she showed and how. OnlyFans became her primary source of income. Rumors exploded around her earnings, with some claiming she was making millions per month. She flatly denied those figures, calling them internet fantasy and pointing out how wildly inaccurate online net worth speculation tends to be. Still, even without precise numbers, it is widely accepted that she ranks among the platform's top earners. The backlash, however, intensified. To critics, the move felt hypocritical. She had condemned the adult film industry as exploitative, only to pivot into monetizing sexualized content again. Mia's defense was structural rather than moral. She argued that OnlyFans gave her total control. She was no longer an employee, she was an owner. She decided what to post, how often, and to whom. She could block abusive users instantly. To her, that autonomy made all the difference. There is some merit to that argument. Ownership does matter. But it does not resolve the broader contradictions. Despite claiming she does not post nudity, nudity has appeared. Despite saying she escaped predatory dynamics, similar dynamics exist within the OnlyFans ecosystem, often through third-party management companies that recruit young, vulnerable creators and extract profits behind the scenes. Exploitation does not disappear simply because the platform changes. One of Mia's core criticisms of the adult film industry was its alleged connection to trafficking and coercion. Yet those same concerns have been documented in subscription-based content spaces as well, including cases involving underage creators using false identification and content being marketed in ethically questionable ways. The problem, in other words, may not be the format, but the broader incentive structure. Perhaps the most unresolved contradiction lies in Mia's own explanation for why the industry harmed her. She has repeatedly said that adult films permanently damaged her reputation, stripped her of privacy, and caused men to objectify her in ways that made public life unbearable. She described feeling watched, reduced, and exposed, one search away from being defined forever by her past. The obvious question, then, is how OnlyFans meaningfully changes that outcome. The content may be self-directed, but the objectification does not vanish. The permanence does not vanish. The internet does not forget simply because the revenue model improves. The most consistent variable appears to be compensation. When she felt underpaid, the industry was framed as irredeemably evil. When she gained control and significantly higher earnings, the framing shifted to empowerment. That doesn't make her dishonest, but it does suggest that money, autonomy, and narrative are tightly intertwined. In the end, Mia Khalifa's story is less about whether she was exploited once and more about how people reinterpret past choices once they gain leverage. Control changes perspective. Profit changes language. And empowerment, in the modern attention economy, often looks indistinguishable from the very systems it claims to reject. At some point, the framing shifted. What was once described as damaging and exploitative suddenly became empowering. Mia herself has acknowledged the contradiction. Her justification is that she stays involved so she can warn younger women not to follow the same path, particularly not at a young age or as a solution to their problems. She has emphasized that the internet is permanent and that regret lasts longer than quick money, but that explanation raises its own problems. Continuing to profit from the same industry, under the same stage name, does not meaningfully discourage others from entering it. In fact, it arguably does the opposite. If the goal were genuinely to distance herself and serve as a cautionary tale, the logical move would be to leave the space entirely, abandon the name associated with exploitation, and build something unrelated. Instead, she has leaned further into the brand. That doesn't make her evil, it makes her human. Money is a powerful motivator, and there is nothing inherently wrong with wanting financial security. The issue is not the choice itself, but the insistence on wrapping it in moral framing. When Mia celebrated her one-year anniversary on OnlyFans publicly and proudly, it undercut the idea that this was a reluctant or purely cautionary endeavor. Her personal life continued to shift alongside her public image. That period included the end of her marriage, a subsequent relationship with a musician that later ended, and an overall improvement in how the internet received her. By 2022, she leaned fully into her persona. She announced a partnership with Playboy. In 2023, she launched a body jewelry brand with an intentionally provocative name. Controversy no longer followed her unwillingly. She seemed to anticipate it. That pattern continued. In October 2023, during the Hamas attacks in Israel, she posted a tweet that was widely criticized for being flippant and poorly timed. Regardless of political stance, the comment failed to read the gravity of the moment. Although she later clarified her intent as pro-Palestinian rather than mocking, the damage was done. Playboy terminated their partnership, citing her remarks as unacceptable. Her response doubled down rather than softened, framing the loss as a moral badge rather than a misstep. Soon after, she sparked another wave of debate by stating that she had been diagnosed with ADHD, OCD, and autism during her school years. While this may be true, it was the first time such claims had been publicly mentioned, and they appeared abruptly, without prior context. There is no definitive way to assess their validity from the outside, and it's not appropriate to diagnose or dismiss. What matters is that, once again, the announcement became part of a broader pattern, personal disclosures surfacing at moments of heightened attention. To this day, Mia maintains a consistent core narrative that she was young, naive, manipulated into adult work, underpaid, and left to absorb all the long-term consequences while corporations profited. And while it would be unfair to say she was not a victim at all, it is equally unfair to accept that narrative without scrutiny. The record shows a more complicated reality. She posted explicit content online before entering the professional industry. She worked as a stripper during college. She showed interest in adult work prior to being approached. She signed contracts with transparent terms. She participated in a scene she knew would be offensive. She defended it publicly at the time. She leveraged the fame to negotiate better terms. She left when the backlash became unbearable. When she could not reintegrate into a normal life, she reframed the story in a way that resonated with public sympathy, and later returned to monetizing the same image when it became more profitable and controllable. Where she does deserve empathy is in her relationship with her former husband, who pursued her as a teenager and whom she described as having a severe pornography addiction. That dynamic likely influenced many of her decisions, and regardless of offense, no one deserves death threats. Those threats, not the scenes themselves, are what truly destroyed any chance she had at anonymity or a conventional life. But accountability still matters. No one forced her to sign those contracts. No one forced her to perform. She left on her own terms. And today, she is extraordinarily wealthy, earning far more than most people ever will, from an industry she continues to denounce. In the end, Mia Khalifa's story is not one of pure exploitation or pure empowerment. It is a story of choices, consequences, revision, and reinvention. She can be both harmed and responsible. Those truths are not mutually exclusive, even if her public narrative often treats them as such.